Hi, my name is Sebastian Baltes and I'm going to present our journal first paper, Contextual Documentation Referencing on Stack Overflow. This is joint work with Christoph Treude and Robillard. Software engineering is knowledge intensive. There are many different software documentation resources out there on the internet that developers might consult depending on the task at hand, depending on the information needs. However, those documentation resources do not exist in isolation. They rather form a documentation ecosystem, and Stack Overflow can be considered a major information broker within that ecosystem. Manifestation of that role as an information broker are the many hyperlinks that you see in Stack Overflow posts and comments, pointing to different documentation resources such as API documentation, developer tutorials, and sometimes even Wikipedia articles that describe concepts related to the question being discussed on Stack Overflow. In the best case scenario, those links provide recommendations for specific information that is relevant to the thread, relevant to the question being discussed. And I selected an example here, a question about regular expressions in Java, where a user points to a tutorial provided by Oracle about regular expressions. And within that tutorial, the user points to a specific subsection that may be relevant for the person asking the question and for readers of the thread. In the worst case scenario, or one of the worst case scenarios, user might not add any information at all, while even making fun of the person asking the question. Like in this question, which is also about regular expressions in Java. And one user commented that this particular question reminds them about a certain XKCD comic they know. And this certainly does not add information to the thread and is not helping the person asking the question or readers of the thread. So this is maybe kind of a discouraged usage of links on Stack Overflow. We also saw an interesting phenomenon on Stack Overflow that we labeled linked mentions. For example, in this question, user referred to certain data types in Java, and they linked the array list to, so the term array list in the answer to the API documentation for that particular collection. And we saw that quite frequently on Stack Overflow, those linked mentions pointing to API documentation. Our research question here was to analyze how and why documentation resources are referenced in Stack Overflow threads. And to investigate this, we looked at two different cases, regular expressions in Java, so threads about regular expressions in Java, and threads about Android software development on Stack Overflow. We investigated these two cases using a mixed methods research design. We started by developing a regular expression-based UL classifier that allowed us to determine whether a certain link points to documentation resource and which category of documentation resource it points to. We then used a set of classified links to sample two sets of links for both cases. One, which we then qualitatively coded, and we looked at the context and the purpose. So meaning how was the link used in the post and why was it added to the post. We also conducted association rule mining to determine the relationship between certain documentation resources and purposes for adding the links. And we also built logistic regression models to see which features make it more or less likely that a certain post contains a link to a certain documentation resource. this is our overall study design. We started with the ESEC data set, which provides access to links and posts and comments on Stack Overflow. For the regular expression case, we selected all threads tagged as Java regex. For the Android case, we looked for threads tagged as Java Android. From those threads, we extracted all links from posts and comments, and we then used the 25 most frequently referenced domains in those two cases to build a classifier that allowed us to determine whether a certain link points to a documentation resource and to which category of documentation it links. And 25 is not a magic number here. We determined this based on the distribution of links per domain. So there are a few domains on Stack Overflow that are quite frequently referenced, and then it drops quite fast, the number of links per domain. So we decided at some point 25 links, 25 top 25 domains to stop refining our classifier. Because we were already able to classify about 80% of the links in our first case and about 70 in our second case. We then qualitatively coded a stratified sample from each of the cases to determine link context and purpose. To do this, we developed in several iterations a coding guide, and that coding guide described when we consider a certain link to be part of a certain purpose category, the same for context, and all three authors participated in this coding. So we coded all links we selected independently and then discussed them to build this common coding guide. And with the labeled sets of links, we then mined for association rules between link purposes, link contexts, and certain documentation resource categories. So these were the documentation resource categories that our classifier was able to identify, and the classifier and the regular expressions we used for this classification are available on GitHub. So you see there that one of the documentation resource categories was Stack Overflow itself. So a link on Stack Overflow can, of course, also point to other posts on Stack Overflow. Other categories included Java API documentation, independent tutorials. So independent meaning, for example, a tutorial about Java that is not coming from Oracle directly, but from some third party. We had Wikipedia as a documentation resource, but also in very few cases, YouTube videos, Android issues, and so on. So this is one example how the classifier works. So it basically matches certain domains or subdomains, in this case of stackoverflow.com. And then by looking at links to Stack Overflow, we decided which subpages of Stack Overflow are considered documentation and which are not. And you see here the ones we selected, and this includes posts, revisions of posts, and comments on Stack Overflow. And we ignored subpages such as user profiles, for example. If you look at the most frequently referenced domains, we see that Stack Overflow itself is in fact the most frequently referenced category of documentation resources. And then we see difference between the two cases. For example, that for Java regex 101, which is not too surprising, is one of the most frequently referenced domains, and for Android, it's android.com and also google.com. So based on this classification, we then wanted to have a closer look at a sample of links to determine the link context and purpose of those links. And since this is time consuming, we wanted to have a diverse set of links to code. We therefore conducted a stratified sampling, and we selected up to 40 links per documentation resource, 10 from questions, 10 from answers, 10 from question comments, and 10 from answer comments. In some cases, there were, for example, not 10 answer comments with links, and therefore it's up to. So if just 8 existed, we selected 8. And if there were more, we randomly selected 10. We then used these stratified samples, so one sample for each case, to iteratively develop a coding guide that mentioned when we apply certain code. We tracked our agreement and discussed our coding after each iteration, and then used a majority vote to resolve disagreements. So all 3 authors coded all links in the samples. For context, we decided to apply 3 different codes: quote, summary, and link only. They are pretty straightforward. For quote, a user copied content from an external resource into Stack Overflow and then used the link to attribute the source. For summary, the user summarized in their own words certain content from that linked documentation resource. And sometimes we also found link-only comments where there was no context at all, just a link as a pointer to an external or internal documentation resource. For purpose codes, we had quite a few. For example, a purpose could be providing a definition or explanation of a concept that was mentioned in the thread, or a specific recommendation to use a certain API or framework, for example. And what we see here in the bar chart is that there was a significant difference between the purposes we saw for the 2 cases. For example, links to concept descriptions were twice as common in the regular expression case compared to the Android case, which makes sense because regular expressions have a strong theoretical foundation, and it makes sense to point to descriptions of certain concepts related to regular expressions. We provide the annotated links as well as the coding guide on Zenodo. You find the data set when you follow this link here. We then use the labeled links to mine association rules between link purposes and documentation resource categories. We did this to validate our coding, but also to explore this relationship. And you see, for example, that Wikipedia links are frequently used to provide definitions or descriptions of concepts, and Java API links are often used in the form of linked mentions. These embedded links to API documentation that I introduced earlier in the talk. I want to conclude the talk with some selected results. So I mentioned that we determined all those different purpose categories, and in our discussion, we arranged those purposes on a purpose spectrum ranging from citation to recommendation links, which means that for some of the purpose categories, the link was not really provided to be followed or consulted. It's more a way of citing content, of attributing content. But on the other end of the spectrum, for the recommendation links, those posts and comments often even contained explicit requests to follow the link to read about a certain concept or technology that is relevant for the thread. And this is interesting when you compare it to Stack Overflow's recommendation to add context to every link that you add to a Stack Overflow post, because we found that it's not always necessary to add context. For example, when you see the link mentions, it's just an additional value that this link provides. It makes it easy for readers to just go to the API documentation for a certain collection, for example, being used in a post. And there's no need to provide additional context there. On the other hand, if users provide pointers to background reading or related frameworks, APIs, then if it's a specific recommendation, it makes sense to add some context as to why this link is relevant and why it should be followed and consulted. We also found that links are a reflection of the information needs that are typical to a certain technology domain. As you saw in the bar chart earlier, links to concept descriptions were twice as common in threads about regular expressions compared to Android. And as I mentioned earlier, somehow makes sense because regular expressions have a strong theoretical foundation. And yeah, that's why pointing to concept descriptions is just more frequent there. But it's also a nice general observation to see that the purposes of links differ between certain selected technology domains here. The ultimate goal of our research is to improve the efficiency of information diffusion between Stack Overflow and the broader software documentation ecosystem. And based on our results, one idea is to develop a tool that assists readers of Stack Overflow threads by automatically classifying links along the purpose spectrum I just mentioned. And this would help them to decide whether it's worth following a link or not. Thank you very much for your attention. You'll find a preprint of the paper on my website. Have a great conference.